I spent 30 years defending the rules that protected everyone else, but I never realized the hardest rule I would break was the one I created for my own heart. I remember the exact moment I admitted that truth to myself. I was 53 years old, standing in my quiet kitchen before sunrise, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The world saw me as a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. I was Eleanor Whitmore, a federal prosecutor who built a career on discipline, logic, and responsibility. I knew how to read evidence. I knew how to find the truth. I knew how to separate emotion from decisions. But when it came to my own life, I had spent years avoiding the questions I was most afraid to answer. After my divorce, I convinced myself that peace was enough. My apartment was organized. My career was successful. My days followed a predictable rhythm. I told myself that stability was the same thing as happiness. For a while I believed it. Then Sophie Bennett walked into my life and quietly challenged everything I thought I understood about myself. I first met Sophie during a community project connected to a legal initiative my office was supporting. She was a documentary photographer, 28 years old, with a camera around her neck and a way of looking at people that made them feel noticed. Most people who met me saw the title first. They saw the prosecutor. They saw the woman who carried herself with confidence and rarely showed uncertainty. Sophie did not seem interested in any of that. She asked me questions about my thoughts, not my position. She listened when I answered. That alone felt unusual. During our first conversation, she smiled and said, "You know, you look like someone who has spent a long time being responsible for everyone except yourself." I almost laughed because I thought she had misunderstood me. But later that evening, I found myself thinking about those words. Nobody had ever described me that way before. My life had been built around expectations. Be professional. Be composed. Be careful. Those rules helped me succeed. They protected me from mistakes. But they also created a distance between me and the parts of life I stopped allowing myself to experience. Working with Sophie was supposed to be temporary. A simple collaboration between two people from different worlds. She was creative, spontaneous, and guided by emotions. I was structured, careful, and guided by facts. We should have had nothing in common. Yet somehow, our conversations became the moments I looked forward to most. I noticed small things about her. The way she became excited when telling stories about people she photographed. The way she found beauty in ordinary places. The way she treated every person as if their story mattered. And slowly, something unexpected happened. I started remembering a version of myself I thought was gone. A woman who laughed more easily. A woman who had dreams beyond her career. A woman who did not always need to have every answer. 53, I thought I knew exactly who I was. Then Sophie appeared, and for the first time in years, I wondered if I had only known the person I was trained to become. I wondered who I might be if I finally allowed myself to choose something different. The first thing I noticed about Sophie Bennett was that she never seemed impressed by the things that impressed everyone else. In a world where people often judged me by my position, my reputation, or the decisions I made in a courtroom, Sophie looked at me like I was simply another person trying to figure life out. That was unfamiliar. And maybe that was exactly why I found myself wanting to know more about her. Our community project required us to spend more time together than I expected. At first, I treated it like any other professional responsibility. I arrived prepared, kept my conversations focused, and reminded myself that Sophie was simply someone I was working with. But Sophie had a way of making ordinary moments feel different. During one afternoon meeting, we sat in a small conference room reviewing photographs for the project. She showed me images of people she had met while traveling across the country. They were not famous people. They were not powerful people. They were everyday individuals with stories most people would never hear. Everyone has a moment when they feel invisible, Sophie told me. I like capturing the moments when they realize they matter. I looked at one of the photographs and understood why her work affected people. Sophie was not just taking pictures. She was paying attention. She noticed details that others ignored. For years, I had built my career around searching for facts. Sophie reminded me that facts were only one part of the truth. People had emotions, memories, and experiences that could not always be measured. As we continued working together, I started noticing small changes in myself. I stayed a little longer after meetings instead of rushing back to my schedule. I asked Sophie about her life instead of only discussing the project. I found myself smiling at stories I normally would have dismissed as distractions. That surprised me more than I wanted to admit. I had spent so many years believing control was the key to a successful life. But Sophie seemed to move through the world with a kind of confidence that came from accepting uncertainty. One evening after we finished a long day of planning, Sophie and I walked through a quiet neighborhood near the project location. The streets were peaceful, and the evening air carried the feeling of a city slowing down. "Do you ever do anything just because you want to?" she asked. I looked at her, confused by the question. "Of course," I answered automatically, but the moment the words left my mouth, I realized I was not sure they were true. Sophie noticed my silence. She did not push. She simply smiled and said, "That is a difficult question for a lot of people." Her kindness made the question stay with me. Later that night, I sat in my apartment and thought about how easily Sophie had reached a part of me that I had ignored for years. She did not challenge my career. She did not criticize my choices. She simply made me wonder if there was more to life than being responsible all the time. The strange part was that I was not afraid of Sophie. I was afraid of the version of myself that appeared whenever I was around her. A version who laughed more. A version who felt curious again. A version who wondered if happiness could still surprise me. And that was the first moment I realized Sophie was not changing my life. She was reminding me that I still had one. The more time I spent with Sophie, the more I realized how unusual our connection was. It was not built on grand gestures or dramatic moments. It grew through small conversations, quiet afternoons, and the feeling that I could finally take off the armor I had worn for years. I was used to people seeing me as someone who always had control. Sophie was the first person who seemed to understand that control was something I learned because I needed it, not because it was who I truly was. Our project continued moving forward, and with every meeting, we became more comfortable around each other. I noticed how easily Sophie could turn a simple conversation into something meaningful. She would ask questions most people never thought to ask. "What made you choose law?" she asked me one afternoon while we were reviewing project materials. It was a simple question, but I found myself thinking about the answer longer than expected. "I wanted to make a difference," I said. "I wanted to help people." Sophie smiled softly. "That sounds like something you still want." I looked at her because I was not sure if that was true. For years, my work had become about deadlines, responsibilities, and expectations. Somewhere along the way, I stopped remembering the reason I started. Sophie had a way of bringing forgotten parts of myself back into the light. In return, I started learning about her. Behind her confident smile was someone who had also experienced disappointment. Sophie told me that photography became important to her because she wanted to preserve moments people often overlooked. Her father had once told her that ordinary days were the ones people remembered most when they looked back on their lives. That belief stayed with her. She wanted people to know their stories mattered. I admired that about her. Sophie did not chase attention. She searched for meaning. One Saturday morning, we met at a local market to collect photographs for the community project. It was supposed to be a simple work assignment, but somehow it felt different. Without the office around us, without titles or expectations, we were simply two people walking through the city. Sophie laughed when I admitted I had never tried some of the food stands there. "You are 53 years old and have never tried this," she joked. I smiled. "I have been busy." She looked at me with a playful expression. "That is your answer to everything, Eleanor." Her words were light, but they stayed with me. Busy. That was the explanation I had given myself for so many things I avoided. Busy was why I never traveled. Busy was why I never explored new interests. Busy was why I accepted loneliness as if it were a natural part of adulthood. That evening, I realized something had changed. I was no longer just interested in Sophie because she was different from me. I was interested because she made me feel like I could become different too. But that realization also brought uncertainty. The age difference between us was impossible to ignore. Our lives looked completely different on paper. I had spent decades building a reputation. Sophie was still creating hers. I wondered if I was seeing something real, or simply reacting to the excitement of feeling alive again. Yet every time I questioned it, I remembered the same truth. Sophie never asked me to become someone else. She only encouraged me to stop hiding. And for the first time in years, I began wondering if following my own heart was not the opposite of responsibility. Maybe it was the responsibility I had avoided the longest. For most of my life, I believed emotions were something that needed to be managed carefully. I believed feelings could cloud judgment, create complications, and lead people away from the choices they should make. That belief helped me build my career. It helped me become someone others could depend on. But spending time with Sophie was forcing me to question whether I had confused control with happiness. The truth was, I was beginning to look forward to moments that had nothing to do with my work. I looked forward to her messages about the project. I looked forward to hearing her thoughts. I looked forward to the way she could make an ordinary afternoon feel memorable. That realization should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Sophie and I stayed behind to organize photographs for the community presentation. The office was quiet, and the usual pressure of deadlines felt far away. She looked through the images while I watched her carefully choose which moments mattered most. "How do you decide what makes a picture important?" I asked. Sophie paused and smiled. "I think it is usually the moments people almost miss." Her answer stayed with me because it felt like she was talking about more than photography. Maybe she was talking about life. Maybe I had spent years ignoring moments because I was too focused on the next responsibility waiting for me. "You know," Sophie said, "I think people assume someone like you has everything figured out." I laughed softly. Someone like me? Someone who is always calm, always prepared, always certain. I looked down at the papers in front of me. "That is just what people see." Sophie became quiet. "What do you wish they saw instead?" The question caught me off guard. Nobody asked me questions like that. Not because people did not care, but because I had become very good at making sure nobody needed to ask. After a long pause, I answered honestly, "I wish they saw that I am still learning." Sophie smiled gently. "I think that is the most honest thing you have said to me." Her words stayed with me long after we left the office. Over the next few weeks, our connection continued to grow. We talked about books, places we wanted to visit, and memories we rarely shared with other people. Sophie told me about her dreams of creating a photography project that focused on women whose stories were often ignored. I told her about the younger version of myself who once wanted to travel and write, before I convinced myself that practical choices were the only responsible ones. For the first time, I admitted something I had avoided for years. I missed that person. But with every beautiful moment came a question I could not ignore. Sophie was 28. I was 53. The difference between us was not just a number. It represented two completely different stages of life. I had spent decades building a reputation. She was still exploring where life could take her. I wondered what people would think. I wondered what my colleagues would say. I wondered if I was being unfair to her by allowing myself to feel this connection. Sophie noticed my hesitation one afternoon when we were walking after a project meeting. "You are thinking too much again," she said with a smile. I looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because you disappear into your thoughts whenever something matters to you." That sentence surprised me. She was right. I had spent my entire life analyzing risks before making decisions. But Sophie was not asking me to ignore reality. She was simply reminding me that not every meaningful choice could be measured like a case file. And for the first time, I wondered if my greatest responsibility was not always following the rules I created. Maybe it was finally being honest about what I wanted. The hardest part about getting closer to Sophie was not admitting that I enjoyed being around her. The hardest part was admitting why. For years, I had been proud of my ability to separate emotions from decisions. I believed that was one of the reasons I became successful. I could walk into difficult situations, stay calm, and make choices based on facts. But Sophie made me realize that emotions were not always something to control. Sometimes they were something to understand. The community project brought us closer with every passing week. We continued working together, but our conversations slowly became more personal. I learned about the small details that made Sophie who she was. She loved old bookstores, quiet mornings, and exploring places most people ignored. She could walk down a familiar street and find a story hidden in a simple moment. I admired that because I had spent so much of my life moving too quickly to notice anything outside my responsibilities. One afternoon, Sophie invited me to join her while she photographed a local neighborhood for the project. First, I hesitated. My instinct was to check my schedule, consider my workload, and find a practical reason to say no. But then I surprised myself. I said yes. We spent several hours walking through the area, talking about everything and nothing. It felt easy. That was what surprised me most. Being around Sophie did not feel complicated. It felt natural. At one point she looked at me and said, "You know, you are different when you are not working." I smiled. "Different how?" "You seem lighter," she answered. "Like you are not carrying the whole world on your shoulders." I wanted to argue with her, but I knew she was right. I had spent so many years being the person everyone depended on that I forgot what it felt like to simply exist. Later that week, I received an invitation to attend a professional event with several colleagues from my office. It was the kind of event where reputation mattered. People discussed careers, achievements, and future opportunities. As I stood in that room surrounded by people who knew my professional identity, I found myself thinking about Sophie. I wondered what she would notice about the moment. Would she see the success everyone else saw? Or would she see the woman standing behind it? That question stayed with me. The following day, Sophie and I had coffee after working on the project. She looked at me carefully and asked, "Are you worried about what people would think?" I knew exactly what she meant. I looked down at my cup before answering. I think I spent my whole life making sure nobody had a reason to question my choices. Sophie nodded. That sounds exhausting. It was such a simple statement, but it touched something inside me. Because it was true. I had built a life where every decision was explained, justified, and approved. There was comfort in that. But there was also a cost. I looked at Sophie and realized something that both excited and frightened me. I was no longer only curious about her. I cared about her. I cared about her dreams. I cared about her happiness. I cared about the way she saw the world. And that was the first moment I understood why this felt different. Sophie was not tempting me to abandon my values. She was showing me that my values could include joy, connection, and a life beyond responsibility. Still, one question remained in my mind. Could two people from completely different stages of life find a way to choose each other without losing themselves? The moment I realized I was truly changing was not during a dramatic event. It happened quietly, in a moment when I caught myself looking forward to the future instead of simply managing the present. For years, I had measured my life by accomplishments. Cases won, responsibilities completed, expectations fulfilled. I had built a reputation as someone who could always be trusted to do the right thing. But Sophie made me question something I had never considered before. What if doing the right thing also meant allowing myself to be happy? That question stayed with me as our connection continued to grow. I became more aware of how much Sophie had changed my daily life. She encouraged me to leave work at a reasonable hour. She reminded me that not every moment needed to be productive. She made me laugh at things I would normally overlook. And somehow, without trying, she brought back parts of me that I thought had disappeared years ago. But I also knew reality existed outside of our conversations. The difference between our ages was something I could not ignore. I had lived an entire lifetime before Sophie was even beginning hers. I had established my career, built my identity, and experienced a marriage that ended. Sophie was still exploring the possibilities ahead of her. Sometimes I wondered if I was being selfish by allowing myself to feel something so unexpected. One evening, I finally shared those fears with her. We were sitting outside a small cafe after finishing another project meeting. The city was calm, and for once I was not thinking about deadlines or responsibilities. "Do you ever worry that we are from completely different worlds?" I asked. Sophie looked at me thoughtfully. "Of course I do," she answered honestly. Her response surprised me. I expected her to dismiss my concerns. Instead, she acknowledged them. "But different does not always mean wrong," she continued. "Sometimes it means two people have something new to learn from each other." I looked at her and realized that Sophie never tried to pretend our situation was simple. She understood the challenges. She understood the questions people might ask. But she also understood something I had forgotten. A meaningful connection was not created because everything was easy. It was created because two people chose to understand each other. That night, Sophie shared something personal with me. She told me that despite her younger age, She often felt pressure to prove herself. People saw her as inexperienced because of her age. They assumed creativity meant she lacked seriousness. But she had spent years building her own path and proving that her choices mattered. Hearing that changed the way I saw her. I realized I had been looking at our differences without seeing our similarities. We were both women who had spent years trying to prove ourselves. We were both people who had learned to hide uncertainty behind confidence. The biggest surprise was discovering that Sophie did not make me feel younger. She made me feel more like myself. She reminded me that curiosity was still possible. That excitement was still possible. That starting a new chapter did not have an age limit. But just as I began accepting my feelings, a new challenge appeared. A conversation with someone from my professional circle made me realize that people were starting to notice how close Sophie and I had become. Nothing inappropriate had happened. We had respected every boundary. Yet I knew the world often judged situations before understanding them. For the first time, I felt the weight of a decision I could not avoid. Was protecting the life I had built more important than embracing the life I still wanted to discover? The hardest decisions in life are rarely the ones where the answer is obvious. They are the ones where every choice has a cost. I had spent my entire career understanding difficult decisions. I knew how to examine facts, consider consequences, and choose the path that created the least damage. But when the decision involved my own heart, I discovered that experience did not make it easier. It only made me more aware of everything I could lose. After people began noticing how often Sophie and I were working together, I became more cautious. I told myself it was because I wanted to protect her. I told myself it was because my position required responsibility. And those things were partly true. But there was another truth I did not want to admit. I was afraid. I was afraid of judgment. I was afraid of questions. I was afraid that after spending decades building a respected life, one unexpected connection could change how people saw me. Sophie noticed the distance almost immediately. She was always observant, and she understood people better than I expected. One afternoon after we finished a meeting, she looked at me and asked, "Did I do something wrong?" The question caught me off guard. "No," I answered quickly. "Then why does it feel like you are trying to disappear?" I did not have an easy answer. Because the truth was, I was not pulling away from Sophie because she had done anything wrong. I was pulling away because she had become important. And that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I told her that my career mattered. That my reputation mattered. That there were things I needed to consider. Sophie listened quietly. She never became angry. She never tried to convince me that my concerns were meaningless. Instead, she said something that stayed with me. "Eleanor, I understand that your life has rules, but I hope you remember that you are a person before you are a position." I carried those words with me for days. Because she was right. Somewhere along the way, I had become so focused on being responsible that I forgot I was allowed to want things. I was allowed to feel uncertain. I was allowed to choose something because it brought me happiness. But fear has a way of making people believe that avoiding pain is the same as protecting themselves. I had spent years doing exactly that. Avoiding disappointment, avoiding risk, avoiding anything that could make me feel vulnerable. Then Sophie came into my life and showed me that vulnerability was not weakness. It was connection. A few weeks later, I received an opportunity to lead an important legal initiative that would require months of focus and travel. It was the kind of opportunity one would have accepted immediately in the past. It represented success. It represented progress. But this time I hesitated. Not because I did not value my career. I did. But because I finally understood that there were parts of life that could not be postponed forever. When I told Sophie about the opportunity, she smiled and encouraged me to take it if it was truly what I wanted. That surprised me. I expected her to be disappointed. Instead, she reminded me that love was not about asking someone to give up their dreams. It was about supporting them while they pursued them. That was when I realized something important. The challenge was not choosing between my career and Sophie. The real challenge was learning how to stop choosing fear over everything else. But before I could understand what that meant, circumstances were about to test whether I truly believed it. For the first time in many years, I found myself standing at a crossroads that had nothing to do with my career. There were no legal documents in front of me, no evidence to analyze, No clear answer hidden inside a set of facts. There was only a choice about the kind of life I wanted to live. The professional opportunity one received was everything my younger self would have celebrated. It was a chance to take on greater responsibility, to prove myself again, and to continue building the reputation I had worked so hard to create. But now there was another part of my life that mattered just as much. Sophie. The surprising part was that Sophie never asked me to choose her over my dreams. She never wanted to become the reason I changed my path. She wanted me to be honest with myself. That was something I had never expected. I had spent so much time protecting myself from making mistakes that I forgot mistakes were not the only things that could hurt. Regret could hurt too. A few days before I had to make my decision, Sophie and I met at a small park near the city center. It was one of those quiet afternoons where nothing dramatic happened, but everything felt important. We sat on a bench watching people walk by, and for a while neither of us said anything. I realized I was comfortable with silence around her. That was rare for me. Most of my life had been filled with conversations where I needed to explain, defend, or prove something. With Sophie, I did not feel like I had to perform. "You know what I admire about you," she finally said. I looked at her and smiled. "I have a feeling you are going to tell me something I do not expect." She laughed softly. "You have spent your whole life being strong. But I think you are finally learning that being open is also a kind of strength." Her words stayed with me, because deep down I knew she was right. I had always believed strength meant carrying everything alone. I had never considered that strength could also mean allowing someone to stand beside me. When I returned home that evening, I looked around my apartment differently. The same walls, the same furniture, the same quiet space. But something inside me had shifted. I realized I had built a comfortable life, but comfort was not the same as fulfillment. The next morning I made a decision about my career. I accepted the opportunity, but with conditions that allowed me to maintain balance. For the first time, I did not choose the option that required me to sacrifice everything else. I chose a path that respected every part of who I was. When I told Sophie, she smiled. "I knew you would find your own answer." I asked her how she was so sure. She looked at me and said, "Because you are not someone who runs away from difficult choices. You just needed to remember that your own happiness was worth considering." But even after that moment, I knew the hardest part was not over. Accepting my feelings was one thing. Being honest about them with the world was another. There were still questions waiting. There were still conversations I needed to have. And there was one truth I could no longer avoid. For years I had protected the life I built. Now I had to decide if I was brave enough to live the life I wanted. The hardest conversation I ever had was not in a courtroom. It was not during a difficult case or a professional challenge. It was a conversation where I finally had to stop hiding behind the person everyone believed I was. I had spent years being Eleanor Whitmore, the prosecutor who always had an answer, the woman who never lost control, the person others trusted to make difficult decisions. But standing beside Sophie, I realized that I had avoided one important decision for most of my life. I had never asked myself what I truly wanted. Telling people about Sophie was not easy. I knew there would be questions. I knew some people would not understand. I knew our age difference would become the first thing many noticed instead of the connection we had built. But I also knew something else. Sophie had never asked me to become someone different. She never asked me to abandon my career, my values, or the life I had created. She simply gave me the courage to stop pretending that my heart did not matter. When I finally spoke honestly with the people closest to me, I expected disappointment. Instead, I found something unexpected. Some people needed time to understand. Some questions were difficult. But the world did not end because I chose happiness. The life I feared losing was still there. My career was still there. My purpose was still there. The only thing that changed was that I was no longer living as if happiness was something I had to earn. Sophie and I continued building our relationship slowly. We did not rush to prove anything to anyone. We focused on the small moments that had always brought us together. Morning conversations, shared meals, quiet walks through the city, the simple comfort of knowing there was someone who truly saw me. I used to believe that love was something that disrupted a carefully planned life. Sophie taught me that the right connection does not destroy who you are. It helps you return to yourself. Looking back now, I understand that the biggest change was not that I fell for someone unexpected. The biggest change was that I finally allowed myself to be a person instead of only being a responsibility. I was still the same woman. I still cared about justice. I still valued discipline. I still believed in doing what was right. But I also learned that my own happiness deserved a place in my life. If you have ever felt like it was too late to begin again, I hope my story reminds you that new chapters do not belong only to the young. They belong to anyone brave enough to open the next page. Thank you for spending this time with me and listening to this journey. If stories about love, healing, and finding yourself speak to your heart, please consider subscribing and sharing this channel with someone who may need to hear a reminder that it is never too late to choose happiness. The greatest rule I ever broke was the one that told me I had to live without the things that made my heart feel alive.